Standing before this august gathering, I have to admit that I feel like an imposter because I'm not an agronomist or an agriculturalist, just a simple jobbing agricultural economist. My first FAO business card had me designated as project analyst, but I have to say what I was doing felt more like creative writing. When David made me really pay for my curry lunch by giving a talk, we decided that it should be about investment and the art of project planning from a completely personal perspective. We planners don't do research, but try to devise effective ways of delivering research results to the ultimate beneficiaries, the small farmers in developing countries. We don't win Nobel Prizes or World Food Prizes. I believe we are on the cusp of a new era in international development, provoked largely by a certain Mr. Trump. So how should we respond? When preparing this talk, I realised I could choose between two different popular templates about investment. One is, of course, The Apprentice, but I ain't no Lord Sugar, and there is certainly too much experience and too many grey hairs here for you to be classed as apprentices. So it had to be Dragon's Den, making a business case to those who have the money. How can we make investment project proposals in agriculture more attractive to the dragons? Let me give a quick outline of what I plan to cover. First of all, a bit of background about myself, then a look at how the agriculture sector has performed, then a quick review of the overall aid environment, and then to ask, how has agriculture project planning evolved? And what does the future of investment in agriculture look like? And then finally, how should we respond to the downturn in ODA? My 50-odd years has been made up of two parts. Firstly, long-term assignments in country of anything from 4 months to 4 years in about 8 countries, and then short-term missions to around 30 countries. I got into agriculture somewhat unwittingly. I was doing my doctoral research on the Altiplano of Bolivia, looking at rural markets after the 1952 revolution and land reform, which split up latifundia into minifundia. Bartering of onions was quite a big thing then, and I was amazed to see how responsive small buyers and sellers were to market signals even there. After Bolivia, I went to Uganda, lecturing at Makerere University. This was whilst Idi Amin was in power, but despite that, it was a very rewarding period. After a somewhat harried retreat from Uganda, I went to Sudan, to Darfur. Working for Hunting Technical Services, I was on a land use planning exercise to remedy the environmental damage caused by US aid. They had seen lush savanna grass, few animals, and concluded that water was needed. So they went about somewhat indiscriminately drilling deep boreholes, up to 600 metres deep, to provide fossil water. The pictures are of Baggara Arabs, nomadic cattle herders. I think they're probably Rizigat. And onions again. Our survey came up with a package of veterinary services for pastoralists and railway wagons to transport their livestock to Khartoum. We also had a package of services for farmers for the Four, particularly to improve cropping and tillage, and this is where I first came across Jim Harvey. We thought we were mitigating conflict over land and water, and we never saw what was coming 50 years later, which was not so much about land and water, but ethnic warfare, the Rapid Support Force, Janjaweed, against the Sudanese armed forces. But were we just helpless bystanders, or did we fail to find a proper solution? After Darfur, I went to Kenya, working with ILCA on monitoring the World Bank-financed livestock development project, which was setting up group ranches for the Maasai and supporting commercial ranches. The pictures are of Maasai and Samburu, and as you can see, this was a period of real field work with Land Rovers and lots of mud. I spent 4 years in Ethiopia planning agricultural extension projects, but I was always drawn to markets. Here are some photographs of Bati Market, which is on the escarpment overlooking the Danakil Depression, where the Afar exchange their livestock for grain with the Highlanders. So what lessons did I draw from these long-term assignments? I figure I was really lucky to have the opportunity to spend a long time in several countries, which is no longer possible really, unless perhaps if you join an NGO. The lessons were many, but I found that the first few weeks in a new country allowed some objective insights into how things worked that you lost if you stayed longer and risked going native. I also saw the importance of frontline workers in the field, who are the ones who translate policy documents and projects into reality on the ground. I was rather sad to note, however, that there's quite a mismatch of motivation where civil servants often did not share the same views as donors about things like poverty reduction, equality, gender and care for the environment. Strangely, I also became persuaded that having worked inside government, it's how you manage public budgets which makes the difference. So, how well has the agriculture sector performed? The answer is amazingly well. Over the last 60 years, global population has almost tripled from 3 billion to just over 8 billion. Evidence that investment in agriculture has paid off is the fact that over the last 60 years, food production per capita has increased by 47%. And even in Africa, it's increased by 14%. What we've witnessed is reaping the green revolution harvest, with amazing increases in the production of staple cereals, maize, rice and wheat. Of course, there is a long story to tell about nutrition and areas that have fared less well. But the impressive work, especially of Simit and Erie, in breeding led to the green revolution, high-yielding varieties of seed, fertilizer, irrigation, pesticides and mechanization. So, what is happening to the overall aid environment, and how are donors and investors responding to the opportunities in agriculture? It has to be said that the overall future of official development assistance, or ODA, is not promising. The World Economic Forum predicts a cut of 67 billion in overall aid between 2023 and 2026. The OECD similarly projects a cut of as much as 17% in 2025 on top of a cut of 9% the year before. 11 major donors have made cuts. The impact, of course, is greatest on least developed countries, a quarter cut, and sub-Saharan Africa, a quarter or more cut. There has been a general withdrawal from the international aid target of 0.7% of gross national income, with only Norway, Sweden, Denmark and Luxembourg maintaining it. Although it may seem incidental, there's also been a big impact on international aid employment. I see this through managing the vacancies section of TAAI website. There's been a big drop of vacancies posted by UN agencies, CG centres, NGOs and contractors as their budgets have been slashed. What about aid to agriculture? This chart comes from a very useful ODI paper. It shows that ODA to agriculture peaked in the 1980s at around 11 billion per year, or almost 20% of ODA going to agriculture. And since then there's been a gradual downward slide to a low of just 3.7% in 2006, even as total ODA increased. The effect is that the total amount of ODA to agriculture has remained at around 10 billion per year up to the present day. The top blue line represents agriculture, forestry and fisheries plus, which means that it includes rural livelihoods, development food aid, emergency food aid and food security. This chart simply brings us more up to date to 2023. The brown line there shows that aid to agriculture has been stuck at 4 to 5% of total ODA throughout this period. So, who are the faithful donors? Who are the ones continuing to invest in agriculture? The answer is USAID, UK and Germany as bilaterals, and also the multilaterals, World Bank, IFAD and UNDP. Now, plus a number of foundations, especially of course the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, a relative newcomer, and traditional foundations like Rockefeller, MasterCard and Ford. This table shows that whilst agriculture funding has been stuck at around 4% of ODA, both direct budget support and humanitarian funding have surged ahead. Direct budget support has increased from 1.6% of ODA to 6.7% over the period 2018 to 2022. Humanitarian aid has also increased from just over 13% to 16%. World Bank grants and loans to agriculture have fallen from 3.6 billion or 4.9% in FY10 to 2.7 billion in FY24. Now, does this expansion of direct budget support represent disillusionment with agriculture as a way of tackling poverty? Or is it just too complicated? Or perhaps have the projects been poorly designed? So, who is that trumpeting elephant in the room? It's USAID, of course, which has been virtually closed by the Trump administration. In 2024, USAID's budget was 68 billion, operating in 130 countries and with a number of important programs in the agriculture sector, including agricultural knowledge and information systems, and its Feed the Future programs, which included food aid. These cuts have had a huge impact on poor countries' budgets and upon NGOs and contractors who relied on its funding for their work. And by 2025, the budget was less than half at 32 billion. These cuts have been particularly harsh on programs such as mother and child health and for supporting HIV treatment. And there are no funds at all for the Global Fund, for Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, or for the soft window of the African Development Bank. However, there have been bilateral deals struck, country by country, for minerals and strategic influence in exchange for aid. So deals have been struck. Let me give just one example of the impact of US aid cuts at the country level. For example, Ethiopia, which had always been a favoured US aid country. In 23-24, $1.62 billion was cut from the budget, or the equivalent of 28% of Ethiopia's total ODA. This included programs in climate-smart agriculture, drought-resistant crops, water management, and it meant at least 30% or 387 million cut from the budget, and 40% cut in food assistance through WFP, which put 3 million people at risk of losing food assistance. All long-term projects were closed, and 5,000 jobs were lost in NGOs and contractors working in country. So what is happening to UK aid? These two charts from The Economist show the cut back from 0.7% of gross national income to 0.5% and then to 0.3%. But the cut is compounded by a broadening of what can be included in aid. There are large in-donor country expenditures, for example, housing asylum seekers, primary schooling, social services and emergencies are part of this. And the UK allocates more of its aid to such items than any other country in the G7, around 30%. On the day after this curry lunch presentation, the Foreign Secretary, Yvette Cooper, announced the government's approach to ODA. In the light of the need to increase defence spending, she confirmed the move towards allocating 0.3% of GNI to ODA. Within this, 70% would go to the most fragile and conflict-affected countries, Ukraine, Palestine, Sudan and Lebanon. But several countries with humanitarian and development needs, such as Yemen, Somalia, Afghanistan, Pakistan and Mozambique, would have their assistance cut. So, to what extent does private investment offset the cuts to official development assistance? As this chart shows, private investment is large, maybe as much as $2 trillion, but very variable indeed, and most recently seems to have a downward trend, possibly reflecting global insecurity. The previous chart shows how little foreign direct investment goes to Africa. With 20% of the world's population, Africa receives just 6% of inward FDI. Programs like USAID's Feed the Future can leverage substantial amounts of private sector investment, but these mainly benefit middle-income countries, and they focus on health and education, not on agriculture. However, there is a case that small farmers are the real private sector, and there are 500 or 600 million small family farms around the world, and jointly investing perhaps 25 or even $50 billion per year. They are indeed the true entrepreneurs and private investors. A leader and international article in The Economist of 21st of March paint an altogether more optimistic picture of private investment in Africa, reflecting recent developments in the Middle East and the US. By comparison with turbulence in the Middle East and chaos in the US, Africa begins to look less and less risky. Despite being hit with some of the highest tariffs by the US, economic growth in Africa is set to surpass that in Asia in 2026. Indeed, The Economist paints Africa as a destination for investment. It now attracts a wider range of foreign investors than ever, and sensible policies have made its economies more resilient. Not least, it seems that African investors are beginning to invest in Africa, exemplified by Nigerian tycoon Aliko Dangote. However, the article notes that low agricultural productivity still represents a huge challenge. So, how has agriculture project planning evolved over the last 50 years or so? Is the lack of enthusiasm by donors to the agriculture sector due to the lack of bankable projects, as FAO's former DG Jacques Diouf would have us believe? The work of the agricultural planner has been a constant struggle to find ever more effective ways to channel aid or public investment to the agriculture sector. The things we're always looking for are more bang for the buck, or you could say more effective investments, to respond to farmers' needs, to make sure that they have a say, to reduce poverty, of course, and, if we can, to crowd in private investment. But all this means more work for the agricultural planner and more hoops to jump through, new donor requirements to satisfy, such as reporting requirements or priority areas upon which to focus. And then, of course, we're always looking for the proverbial and elusive silver bullet. My question is, are projects in agriculture any better now than 50 years ago? We've had lots of help from different visions and novel approaches, new planning and analytical tools, and endless smart initiatives. But have we done enough to persuade you to make an investment in agriculture? This is probably a pointless question here, because most of you have probably invested your whole lives and careers in agriculture already. So, in Dragon's Den style, I'm going to ask for $5 billion for 1% of equity. At this stage, I would like to shout out to the FAO Investment Centre, where I worked for 20 years, and has just celebrated its 60th anniversary. It started in 1964 as a cooperative programme with the World Bank, and it now has 33 partners, regional banks, funds, UN agencies and bilaterals. Over the 60 years, it's produced almost 2,500 projects in 158 countries worth $276 billion. That's around $3 billion a year. It has honed its project formulation process of reconnaissance, identification, preparation and design to a fine art. In many ways, this was a golden age of agriculture project planning. I don't know how many of you will remember Little Merleys from the industrial sector, who introduced us to shadow pricing to derive economic and social prices. cost-benefit analysis, discounted cash flow, internal rates of return and economic internal rates of return. Followed then by the World Bank's Price-Gittinger with his economic analysis of agriculture projects. In 1995, the Investment Centre launched its guidelines for the design of agricultural investment projects, which became the Bible for anyone working in the centre. However, this was not the last word, and it was followed by the sector-wide approach model of the World Bank, its agriculture investment source book, a new method of analysis called domestic resource cost analysis, and now we have, of course, the World Bank Open Knowledge Repository, where you can go to find anything about everything. It wasn't until the turn of the millennium that I suddenly realised everything had to be evidence-based. I blame Tony Blair and his views about scientific government. We were inundated with data analysis, checks and balances, ranging from project completion reports, monitoring and evaluation, which often occupied about 5% of total project costs, monitoring, learning and evaluation, and operations evaluation. But as budgets got tighter, greater attention had to be given to accountability, and there was a mushrooming of independent evaluations, including the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, which reports to Parliament, the 3IE, the International Initiative for Impact Evaluation, and of course the World Bank's Independent Evaluation Group. There are also lots of think tanks suddenly, everything from aid data through ODI to The Economist and blogs like Hunger Explained. But everyone had best beware of the law of unintended consequences. The impact of investments on women, for example, or on the environment, or on society as a whole. One thing for sure, as an agriculture project planner, the toolbox available has expanded enormously and continues to grow. When I started, all you needed was a pencil and a rubber, of course. Then, needing to talk to farmers, I included a sociologist on my teams who would undertake special surveys of farmers. Then came computers, so typists with stencils and gestetners were no longer needed. Along with computers and word processors came spreadsheets, but these were not always flawless. Then some really clever software called CostStab, which was developed by the Investment Centre with the World Bank, which helped economists to assemble project costs reliably. And then the internet. I remember going to a demonstration of this in FAO around 1995, I think, and we all agreed it would go nowhere. There was certainly no shortage of visions in the agricultural development field. The first, in many ways, was the Green Revolution, which was a genuine scientific breakthrough, with high-yielding varieties of seed, fertilizer, pesticides, irrigation, mechanization. And this formed the basis for agricultural projects for the next 60 years, all built upon the Nobel Prize winner Norman Borlaug. The amazing technology of the Green Revolution had to be disseminated to farmers everywhere. And to this end, Danny Benor in the World Bank developed his Training and Visit, or T&V, extension system. This had been developed in India, where irrigation is widely available, and it turned out not to be quite so suitable for Africa, and many adaptations had to be made. Before long, FAO developed its Farmer Field School approach, an extension system based on its integrated pest management program. This became adapted in many different environments, and in some places even to farmer life schools. However, as I discovered to my cost, this didn't really work in all agricultural systems. I tried to apply Farmer Field School approach to tree crops in Indonesia, only to find that, of course, there's a big difference between having a program related to rice, where you can crop 3 times a year, to a tree crop like rubber or oil palm, where years are required before production begins. Then came participatory planning, built upon the work of Robert Chambers. The idea was to make farmers part of the planning process. So drawing resource maps in the sand became an obligatory part of the planning process. Following the World Bank's insight that farmers should be consulted in preparing agricultural projects, there was a surge of interest in NGOs to serve as intermediaries between farmers and the planners. I worked on such a program in South Bihar, now Jharkhand, and more recently in the Livelihoods and Food Security Trust Fund in Myanmar. However, although NGOs were always very good at participatory planning, they were not always technically competent. Then came direct budget support, which was driven by the increase in ODA and the need to get more money out. However, a side effect of this is often that agriculture was neglected, since it was up to national governments to decide where their priorities should be. In the early 2000s, there was an explosion of interest in cash transfers, such as the famous Bolsa Familia in Brazil and the Productive Safety Nets program in Ethiopia. This seemed to be, in a sense, an admission of defeat that, after all, the farmer knows best, and we shouldn't really be involved in making detailed plans for how he develops his agriculture. After this became microcredit, based on the experience of Muhammad Yunus and the Grameen Bank in Bangladesh, and this had been very successful. However, IFAD, which took this on wholeheartedly, found that it was really the better off who benefited rather than the poor. The latest fashion, or fad, identified by the World Economic Forum, is social enterprise. This is based on the Muhammad Yunus approach, and they estimate there are probably 10 million such enterprises globally, with a turnover of $2 trillion. There are even apparently 2 million such enterprises in Africa. And then, of course, there are global visions, such as the Millennium Development Goals and the Sustainable Development Goals. They are most noteworthy for the fact that they represent the first appearance of poverty and hunger, MDG 1, and then zero hunger, SDG 2. And then the bilaterals had their own individual visions. For example, the DFID livelihoods model, which built upon the work of Andrew Dorwood, which was taken up by Stefan Durkon, is intuitively really impressive. It suggests that only small farmers with sufficient resources of land, labour and cash can actually survive in agriculture. However, it does beg the question of where smallholders who don't have these resources have to step out, and where would they go? Let's turn to initiatives now and see what role they have played in the planning landscape. The first such initiative in which I was involved was FAO's Special Programme for Food Security. This was based on the Director General's idea that there was a shortage of bankable projects, so he gave the job to the Investment Centre. The whole thing was a response to the World Food Summit in 1996, and in the end, some 71 countries were engaged in one way or another, and it eventually merged into FAO's regular programme. An evaluation carried out on the special programme concluded that it was too rigid, not linked to national programmes, failed to see the dependence upon local extension services and input distribution. Indeed, it was a rigid model. The Director General dictated that each family should have 1 hen house, 7 hens and 1 cock, or, if they were slightly bigger, 3 cows and 1 bull. He also wanted to hear the names of all the farmers involved, and he wanted a standard unit to measure yields, kilograms per hectare. I remember one particularly brave director at a big meeting looking at the Director General and, with a straight face, saying, "Should we apply this standard measure to hens and eggs?" So I'm afraid I have to give the thumbs down to this one as well. The next initiative in which I was involved was the Eliminating Food Insecurity in the Horn of Africa initiative, launched by Kofi Annan and executed by FAO's Director General as a response to the severe drought and famine in 2000. Catherine Bertini, Executive Secretary of WFP at the time, was made Special Envoy to the region. This angered Diouf, so he determined to make this initiative his own. We worked with 10 UN agencies and sent teams to all 7 Horn of Africa countries. I ultimately presented a report to the Secretary General and UN heads of agencies in New York. The whole thing was taken up by World Bank, which wanted to set up a Horn of Africa institution. The countries concerned were invited to choose where the headquarters of this should be, and of course they chose Djibouti, the one place which satisfied none of the criteria that we had set down. However, things were going quite well until, at a meeting of the World Food Summit 5.5 years later, we were trying to decide how to set up the headquarters. Suddenly, the doors of the meeting room were flung open, and in strode this massive figure in a white jellabia and turban, who said, "The headquarters of the Horn of Africa institution will be in Khartoum." This was the President of Sudan, no less, Omar al-Bashir. He then left the meeting in disarray, and that was the end of it. However, as we can see, nothing much has changed in the region. There was another crisis in 2003 and then 2006, this time led by WFP. And any attempt to change in the region has been thwarted by the civil war in Sudan. So I'm afraid I have to give a thumbs down to this one as well. The next initiative in which I became heavily involved was the Comprehensive Africa Agriculture Development Programme, or CAADP. This started in 2003 as part of the AU's New Partnership for Africa's Development, or NEPAD. The aim was to increase agriculture sector growth rates and mobilise domestic resources to reduce dependence upon aid. NEPAD became the Africa Union Development Authority later. The Investment Centre deployed its guidelines to help every country to prepare bankable investment projects, and this met with some success. National Agriculture Investment Plans, or NAIPs, are still being used. An evaluation of CADEP concluded that no countries are on track to achieve the 6% rate of agriculture growth which was targeted. The average is just 2 or 3%. Or to meet the 10% of budget going to agriculture. Only Benin, Ethiopia, Lesotho and Malawi ever reached such an allocation. However, it has to be admitted that agriculture value added doubled from 2000 to 2021, keeping pace with population. So things could have been worse. However, I still have to give this a thumbs down. Last but by no means least are the foundations which have sprung up. For example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation Agriculture Development Programme has disbursed almost $5 billion since 2006. So what can initiatives achieve? They are essentially political, and they can, if they're well done, increase the awareness of hunger and the problems facing agriculture. They can also perhaps attract extra resources, even if temporarily. However, we all know that donors are not averse to switching existing resources to new tasks. But there is always the danger that initiatives can divert ministries' attention away from their regular programs, and there will always be high transition costs of training staff, setting up new management systems, and basically delivering what donors want to see. I think it can be said that investment project design has come a long way over the years. When I started out, a project formulation task consisted of a single sheet of paper showing country, sector or subsector, indicative total costs, and a deadline for the submission of the project proposal. Preparations occasionally included a visit to the FAO library, certainly lots of chats over coffee with colleagues, and sometimes a visit to the FAO office in the country concerned. The report followed the guidelines format, and the only footnote was a list of the team members. Current best practice is probably the DFID FCDO business case. I was involved in preparing one for Myanmar. This included weeks of research to carry out the 5 subsets of analysis: the strategic case, appraisal case, commercial, financial and management cases. All proposals had to be supported by detailed and well-documented, credible and respectable sources. And there were dozens of footnotes. Let's have a look at what the future of investment in agriculture might look like. Clearly, climate change and environment are up there as a priority. This means mainly adaptation to increased extreme events. But it's important because food systems account for over 30% of anthropogenic emissions, and over 10% comes directly from agriculture. Methane is the single largest source of greenhouse gases after CO2, maybe 30% of total global warming. And this comes from cattle, of course, and irrigated rice. Pesticides and fertilizer are sources of pollution. and deforestation leads to biodiversity loss and soil erosion. Climate-smart agriculture is now a well-known set of interventions. Drought-tolerant crops, agroforestry, improved soil health, conservation tillage, cover crops, IPM and precision water management. But I was disappointed to see that the nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, where governments commit to reduce carbon emissions by 2035, includes very few projects which are around agriculture. The World Bank now commits around 62% of its agriculture portfolio to its climate focus, well up from just 51% in FY23. Agriculture 4.0 is a set of data-driven technologies, Internet of Things, robotics, and big data analytics. This is very useful for those commercial small farmers, but not for most who are just hanging in there. Then there's regenerative agriculture, which has become the latest holistic farming approach. It is centred on soil health rather than short-term productivity and includes biodiversity, livestock integration and carbon capture. This is a whole package of interventions which could be quite difficult to introduce to small farmers in developing world agriculture. Question is, can it be applied to benefit small farmers in developing countries? And then there's AI. How could we forget that? This covers a multitude of different activities, such as precision agriculture, crop monitoring, but it has a very strong use in research and development, where it can speed up seed breeding, crop protection, for example. Just for fun, I thought I would ask AI whether it would invest in agriculture. And it came up with a rather sensible answer. Yes, but selectively and with patience. And it came up with 4 quite reasonable areas in which to invest: ag tech, inputs, farmland, but not operating farms, and supply chain choke points. And it also gave a very sensible caution to avoid areas with severe water stress and weak governance. The ChatGPT bot also suggested target investments: post-harvest and logistics, irrigation and water efficiency, inputs and services to smallholders, primary production, and, interestingly, ag fintech. But it also recommended to avoid rain-fed monoculture and came up with a list of target countries in East Africa, West Africa, and Asia. Finally, let's think about how we should respond to the downturn in ODA. Certainly we should hone our planning skills, but where should we focus? Is it the best return to taxpayers' money, the highest internal rate of return? Or should it be emergencies? Should it be about crowding in private investment? Or focus on public infrastructure? Or is it really poverty reduction? And what about exit strategies? This is currently an area of active discussion. In The Economist of the 7th of March, an article entitled "Big is Beautiful" about Africa suggests going back to the 1950s structural transformation model of Arthur Lewis, as I understand it. But really, in this day and age, how can we apply AI to benefit small farmers? Interestingly, most of AI's recommended investments go back to the Green Revolution: seed, fertiliser, irrigation, mechanisation. But now these bring only slow incremental gains for small farmers. They're no longer a revolution. So more modern investments target regenerative agriculture, which are about long-term sustainability rather than productivity and farmer incomes. To me, a logical response is to give more attention to innovative forms of finance. Properly targeted ODA can leverage new sources of financing and scale up access to existing technology. Climate finance is clearly at the centre of this. Under the Paris Agreement, donors pledged $100 billion a year, but this has rarely been met. However, in 2022, $116 billion was raised. At COP28, the Loss and Damage Fund raised $786 million, and the Global Environment Fund, GEF, has been around for over 30 years. It has raised $27 billion, as well as $155 billion in co-financing. There are many other sources of finance that should be explored to fill the gap left by ODA. For example, nature finance can be used for biodiversity, climate mitigation and adaptation, tradable carbon credits, sustainability or development impact bonds, which aim to attract private finance by focusing on project performance. Then there are loan guarantees to lower investors' risk, which is used a lot by the IFC. And then there's domestic resource mobilisation, supporting domestic banks to lend to their own farmers. Ethiopia has launched something called diaspora bonds, aimed at the large number of often well-off Ethiopians in the diaspora. They've also launched remittance-backed projects and public-private partnerships. Interestingly, Yvette Cooper's announcement on aid included a commitment to allocate £6 billion to climate finance for mitigation, adaptation and nature, and £6.7 billion to UK-backed climate and nature investments, mobilising private finance. In conclusion, my verdict is yes, agriculture investment project planning has improved. We have 7 decades of experience, with advice coming from all sides, analytical tools we could never have dreamed of, access to big data, communicating with farmers in real time, and, if we want, be flexible in implementing programs. But we should not sit back. We need to look at innovative financing to offset the decline in ODA and FDI that could massively scale up the impact of existing technology. Well, I'm convinced this is a good idea, but are you? Shall we have a show of hands?